I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got a very exciting discussion about how to get things done faster and more effectively. For those who are new to the organization, uh, we're a member-supported organization. So if you like talks like this, if you like the idea of getting fast, frequent, and affordable trains running sooner rather than later, please go to highspeedrail.us and click the Become a Member. And if you're already a member, you can hit that button again. That's perfectly okay. As a quick introduction of who we are, we're a member-supported nonprofit. We help people understand what high-speed rail is, what we need to do in order to make it happen, what the country needs to do, and then how folks like you can help persuade your leaders in your state capitals and in DC to make it happen. So as I said, we've got a really exciting presentation. Chris, if you could do the honors of introducing our speaker.
Sure, happy to. The day is finally here. Someone we work closely with started telling us about this book, about Professor Dunkelman's book, Why Nothing Works, a few months ago, and said, "Oh, you've got to try to get the speaker. You've got to try to get the speaker." And he was kind enough to say yes. And so today's the day. Marc J. Dunkelman is a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and a former fellow at NYU's Marron Institute of Urban Management. During more than a decade working in politics, he worked for Democratic members of both the Senate and the House of Representatives and as a senior fellow at the Clinton Foundation. The author of The Vanishing Neighbor, Dunkelman's work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and Politico. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today. If you have a comment, you can put it in the chat. If you have a question, it helps us to keep those separate. So please use Zoom's Q&A feature for questions. We'll get to as many of those as we can after the talk. But with that, let us turn things over to Professor Dunkelman.
Terrific. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to talk to this audience. I feel like in every talk I listen to, someone says something to the effect of that they're more interested in the questions than in giving the remarks, and often that's not true. They're very excited to hear themselves talk. I'm not. In this case, I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can, because I do feel like an audience like this is going to have lots of interesting comments and questions, and I'm eager to engage, sort of more to hear your expertise. I'm recording this as much as anybody else for future research of mine. So I'm thrilled to be here. I often like to begin talking about this book by talking about something that's not in the book, and that's not even relevant per se to this challenge, but it's about putting you in the right frame of mind. Think about the last time that you and your children, or you and your parents, needed to decide where to go to dinner on a Friday night when you hadn't planned to. I do this. I've got an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and for years, when my wife and I didn't want to cook, we would sort of spring this idea, let's go out to dinner, and then there'd be this discussion that I feel like every family must have about where to actually land, and everyone has a different opinion. My wife inevitably wants to go to some vegetarian restaurant nobody wants to go to, and my older daughter for a long time only ate fried chicken sandwiches, and my younger daughter had the strangest taste, donuts and sushi tonight, whatever. And so there'd be this discussion, and the question was, what is the process you would use as a family to determine, one Friday night after the next, where you went? Would the parents always get to decide? Would everyone get a moment to choose? Tonight's mom's turn, next week it'll be Amelia's turn. How does it work? Would it be that everyone throws it out an idea and then everyone gets a veto? All of these are reasonable ways. I open talks by putting you in this frame of mind because it's not political at all. It's not about whether you support high-speed rail or you're averse to public spending, or you think government is too big or too small. It's just sort of like, what is the process you use to get things done. And the argument of my book is that our sense, the general zeitgeist about who should choose big projects and where they would go and how they'd be ordered, what the details would be, that our general ethos about that sort of question has evolved over the decades. And that really the beginning of progressivism really is which happens sort of right as the big railroads are emerging, flows directly from big railroads. I think this is something that people often fail to understand, the degree to which 19th century American life was about life in island communities. That was what one sort of studious book about the late 19th century talks about, is just the degree to which, if you lived in one little town, you were sort of, your entire life was centered around that one place, and it would take a while to get to the next neighboring town, so that life was really focused on the place where you lived, and that the railroads which connected places upended that norm. Suddenly, whether your town was on the rail line, what the rate was to send a person or freight on that line, what the frequency of the rate, all of these things suddenly began to take over local life. And the people that decided those things were often far away. They were Eastern, you were in a Midwestern state. And suddenly the sort of notion that the mayor of your town or the city fathers of your town or the political machine in your city could control your fate began to erode, and progressivism emerged as sort of an effort to address that challenge. Now, there were sort of two ways to think about this at the time. And, sort of get back to the question of who chooses dinner. One idea was that we should break up the railroads, right? This is where you get the antitrust movement, and the sort of notion that we should return power back to states or even to localities so that they could regulate the big national railroads, the trunk lines and whatnot. That was one idea that stemmed out of progressivism, and that's sort of a notion that you would let each kid and each member of the family choose more, right? You'd spread power in the family to choose where you went to dinner. The other idea, which was behind the Interstate Commerce Corporation and the beginning of big public institutions that starts in the late 1800s, is that you would centralize power in some sort of public bureaucracy that was responsible for all the railroads and setting rates. So there's a whole history, and it's in the book, of this sort of these two different competing impulses within the progressive tradition, relating primarily to railroads and then extending to other industries. But this notion, should we push power up into the hands of a big public bureaucracy like the ICC, which is really the first public commission of its type at the federal level, or should we push it down through antitrust to smaller communities so that they can sort of determine their own fate? This tension between what I call a Hamiltonian impulse to move power up into the hands of big institutions or move it down into the hands of local communities is the sort of what I view as the central tension in American life that is largely unexamined. And it's the crux of my book. And at the time, in the early 1900s, when progressivism really hits its stride, it's the first impulse, the Hamiltonian impulse, to push power up into an institution that can sort of take control of the elements of industrialization that feel out of control and feel like they're sort of steamrolling American life, is the choice that we make largely. And so the early progressive tradition is to take power that exists at the machine level or among the robber barons or by state legislators and put it into the hands of big institutions. I've mentioned the ICC, which is obviously I think 1887, but then like in the 19 teens, we get the Port Authority in New York, which is the first public authority of its type, but it's sort of an archetype of an idea of taking power that has been diffused across a whole bunch of bureaucracies and put it in the hands of one individual bureaucracy that will make all sorts of decisions about how the port will work, so that it's almost more powerful that the chairman, the president of the Port Authority is supposed to be sort of independent of all the sort of the nagging demands of the New York state legislators or even the New York state governor or the New Jersey legislators or people on the banks of the Hudson River and New Jersey state government, and have sort of an expert, a professional doing what is right for the country. And that's sort of a model that sort of takes over. It's part of a generalized zeitgeist in the country where professionalization is happening in all sorts of realms. This is when the bar becomes sort of the standard for lawyers, where we get specialization and academic departments, where in science, in medicine, we have the individual practices and the sort of the specialties of medicine emerge. But there is sort of this impulse to professionalization, and building up public authorities becomes this element in the public realm. So that is a broadly an effort that you see to push power up that extends through most of the 20th century. And sort of in my book, the example that I use of this is sort of most iconic is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is we rarely think about when we are talking about the New Deal, but it is sort of almost archetypical in the sense that here is an agency empowered by the federal government to remake the landscape of the Upper South, which is the most impoverished region of the country, basically the size of England. And they give this one guy, David Lilienthal, who's the vice chairman, but is essentially in control of the whole thing, just this incredible mandate to dam rivers, to seize land, to create reservoirs, to reforest barren parts of the region, to wire up people, wire up individual farms so that people are connected again, or connected for the first time to the electrical grid. And the idea here is not simply, people remember the TVA is not just rural electrification. It is remaking the whole region into a new, more cosmopolitan place. It's taking people who in Roosevelt's mind are still living in the 19th century and bringing them into the 20th. And that was, in that way, Lilienthal and Roosevelt were sort of archetypes of their time. There was this great man notion of progress, that if we empower great men to do big things, they'd be able to do it. And you see that in sort of all sorts of realms of American life. You see it sort of George Patton. You see it in blue ribbon commissions. You see it in public authorities of all sorts, the Federal Reserve. You see it in the Marshall Plan after the war. But the sort of this TVA model, the Marshall Plan was viewed as a TVA for Europe. The LBJ would later refer to the American plans for the Mekong Delta as a TVA for Vietnam. At one point, Martin Luther King wanted a TVA for the Black community in America. This idea that you'd have a centralized administration that would be able to cut through things, cut through barriers, and make the right decision for the public. That all changes. Beginning in the late 1950s, sociologist at Columbia named C. Wright Mills writes a book called The Power Elite. This notion is in his book, and then in the growing movement like the Beat Poets, the New Left, the Students for Democratic Society, the notion there is that the problem isn't that power is too diffused, as was sort of the original progressive creed, but that power is too consolidated. That we've got these powerful institutions that are making decisions on the public's behalf that are either corrupt or self-interested, but that on the whole, they're doing a lousy job. And that the answer to that problem is to rediffuse power back down to local individuals, to local communities, to allow for community control. And so you get sort of through the 60s a growing drumbeat of support for a notion that the real answer to America's big public problems is not to consolidate power, but rather to push it down. This is the Jeffersonian instinct kicking in. This is in the context of the original analogy. Instead of letting mom and dad choose where we're going to go to dinner every Friday night, it is saying everyone should have their own choice, or maybe even everyone should be given a voucher and be able to go and eat on their own if they like. They should all get to pick their own place. But you see, for example, Robert McNamara in Vietnam, that looks like a mistake. It looks like the Rand Corporation is a corrupt entity. We want to push power down so that the great sort of Georgetown set that got us into this mess can't do it again. You see it in Rachel Carson in the book Silent Spring, which sort of reveals the degree to which the people that were supposed to be regulating big agriculture have allowed for DDT to be sprayed on crops such that we've got terrible birth defects. It happens, most notably with Ralph Nader, who is, whose general view is that we need to government-proof the government. Like, his view is that the big regulatory agencies are themselves corrupt. And then the sort of the big moment, I think, that sort of brings it all together, and particularly relevant for this crew, is the publication in 1974 of The Power Broker, Robert Caro's sort of masterpiece on Robert Moses, who was the most powerful man in New York. Not a fan of rail, as I'm sure I suspect that some substantial portion of this audience will have read The Power Broker, but obviously Robert Moses was not a fan of rail. He was the one that built highways all around New York City, and largely starved rail of passengers and of revenue, and really believed that cars were the answer and the future. But it was nevertheless, he was playing a role in building those roads that the great railroad barons of the late 18th century and early 19th century played, in the sense that he was able, from a sort of centralized standpoint, be able to impose his will on the city and the region around New York. And that he was archetypical of Richard Daley in Chicago, and innumerable figures around the country who had consolidated power, and that he was the problem. He was the Robert McNamara. He was the Department of Agriculture, or the big three automakers who were building cars that were unsafe at any speed. And the notion here, again, sort of the notion after reading The Power Broker and seeing how corrupt and destructive Robert Moses had been, the zeitgeist of the country changes, so that we want, instead of putting power in the hands of singular figures, we're going to push it back down to communities. We're going to create the sorts of barriers that we now experience. This is the beginning of a shift to create the barriers that will give the communities that would otherwise be affected by big decisions more say, more sort of additional opportunities um, to to throw sand in the gears. Um, and you see, you know, the Power River comes out in 1974. It wins the Pulitzer in 1975, but in 1969, the end of 1969 and the beginning of 1970, Richard Nixon signs into law the National Environmental Policy Act, which it's sort of remarkable if you go back and read the congressional record about what that bill was supposed to do. The notion of the time was that the highway builders, the people who'd been behind urban renewal, who were building the interstate system, weren't sufficiently cognizant or sensitive to the environmental implications of their big of these big projects. And so the mandate, people don't realize this, but well, the mandate was that those engineers simply had to have a conversation about what the environmental implications would be, just a conversation about it. They thought that environmental impact statements mandated by that law would just be 50 pages where they sort of talked about, well, if we build it here, it's going to have these implications. But then the engineers whose mandate was to build highways at minimal cost would in most cases, maybe they would modify things on the margins, but again, cost would remain the major determinant of what was built and what wasn't built, and that the idea was that these highways were good, that connecting places were good. By over time, through a whole series of changes, mostly on the judicial side, in the sense that judges interpreted what NEPA had meant, that has created this sort of behemoth barrier that we now have to building new things, because before you can do anything, these environmental statements need to look at every single variable that will be affected. And in the absence of that process being considered entirely fair by a judge, you can't move forward. So these 50-page documents envisioned when Richard Nixon signed NEPA into law have turned into volumes and volumes and volumes, making it the soft costs of doing any transportation project or projects across the federal government extremely high. But it wasn't just NEPA. And this is another point that in the world of reform where I live, and I think probably many of you live, NEPA has become sort of a symbol, and there's talk of repealing NEPA now 60 years later. Not serious talk, but that is sort of that is viewed as sort of as what we might need to do. The barriers now to doing projects are so voluminous. It's not just that you have to do environmental reform. It's that in most places you need to have community board reviews. In New York City, for example, zoning is in many cases controlled at the community level. It's that there is historic preservation. It's that there's in my chapter on transportation infrastructure, I go through the history of what's known as the Yarborough Rule. And I just, because I'm eager to get to your questions, I'm not going to go through the whole history of what is called 4F. I sure some people on this call know what 4F is, but it is essentially in the same way that NEPA was designed to be simply a demand that people consider the environmental implications. 4F was passed in the 1966 Transportation Act, a requirement that there be a study of whether there are ways to avoid impacting greenery on transportation projects. And that is interpreted by Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall to mean that no federal transportation project should move forward if, in essence, it touches a blade of grass. And 4F is still in the books. It's been modified slightly. But the notion that you can't move a project forward if it, even impacts a public golf course, presuming that there is some sort of alternative, like that's a huge challenge for any public infrastructure project. I see that I'm at 26 after the hour, so I need to wrap up on some level. The notion here is that over the course of the last 50 years, what we've done to eliminate the scourge of centralized power has been to diffuse power again, so that almost anyone who has a problem has some sort of mechanism to stop the project that they don't like. And that's created sort of this behemoth of small, of soft costs, where it's one thing to sort of say to a developer of a high-speed rail line, a housing developer, or someone who wants to build clean energy infrastructure, we ought to have we got to go through this route and figure it out, and for everyone to have a voice where they can say, I don't like that because it runs through my town, it runs across my farm, it impacts this endangered species of orchid that is in the middle of, this forest, whatever it was, what have you. We have eliminated the ability to take the whole multifaceted series of second and third order changes that come with any project and have someone say, okay, I've heard it all, I've seen it all, I understand all the implications, this is the one I'm going to choose. So when you look at a project, at my former colleagues at Marron, Eric Goldwyn, Alan Levy, who I bet you've heard from previously, they have these sort of remarkable data sets on how much more expensive it is to build public transportation infrastructure in this country versus, New York is bananas compared to the rest of the country. The country is bananas compared to the rest of the English-speaking world. The English-speaking world is worse than the non-English-speaking world. But the per mile on the Second Avenue subway was a crazy cost beyond, for what we were able to do there. Madrid could have built 3 whole subway lines, and that's just 3 stops on the east side. The difference here is not the labor costs. It's not, though that may play a role. It's not the cost of materials. The shift here is that there is no one who has the discretion to decide which projects we're going to do and how we're going to do them. So that when you get to high-speed rail, the challenge, in my view, and I'm very eager to hear what everyone here has to say. The challenge, in my view, is that for high-speed rail, you need straight track bed. And the notion that we're going to find some expeditious way to speed straight lines. I was in New York this morning. I'm now in Providence. I took the Acela. I could have driven faster, probably, from Manhattan to Providence than it took me on the train. And the challenge there is not that we don't know how to build high-speed rail between New York, Providence, Boston, what have you. It's that they are using a route, a stretch of track that is curving and old, and there are probably ways to improve it on the margins technically. But the crucial element is, sometimes I'm on that train and I think to myself, what would it cost to move this track bed, 10 feet, to the west or to the north, depending on where you are on the track, just to move it 10 feet, like the implications along the route, the fights, the legal implications, the amount of wrangling. When the ARC came out, the study that the Federal Railroad Administration did to speed traffic on the Northeast Corridor, the moment that people even had the notion that they were going to change where the track bed was to straighten the line, people came out of the woodwork screaming about that notion. But like that's the crucial element beyond the financing, beyond the technology itself. The question is who gets to decide where the railroad is going to go. I had a piece in the Atlantic 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago now, where I sort of make this crucial distinction, which is that in the old days, the old establishment, the Robert Moses types who prevailed because of the progressivism that emerged at the turn of the 20th century, the David Lilienthal, the TVA, Robert McNamara, Robert Moses, the people who did urban renewal, the sort of notion that there were these powerful, gray-suited, fedora-wearing establishment figures who could make big decisions. They had enormous discretion. They could choose what they wanted to do. And the country reacted at a certain point against them with the notion that we could replace their discretion with procedures that would get us optimal results. It turns out that there is no real alternative to having someone make a decision that involves trade-offs. There's no procedure that will get you to be able to pick a trek bed or a right of way that satisfies everyone. Someone is going to have their farm traversed by the rail. Someone is going to have their small town upended. We can make some sorts of trade-offs in some cases. Maybe we can go above grade or below grade at some point. But like these are the trade-offs that need to be made. And at the moment, it seems to me, the sort of singular crisis, particularly for those who are in favor of high-speed rail, is who is ultimately in control? Who is the person that gets to decide? I've been following, I realize I've been very heavy in this call, and I realize it's a national organization, but I've been very heavy on New York. But I've been, many of you probably follow the fight over congestion pricing in New York City. And the sort of remarkable element that seems to be unnoticed, and I may write this at some point, that goes unnoticed in this fight is that it feels as if no one is in charge. Maybe Governor Hochul is in charge. Maybe the chairman of the Metropolitan Transportation Administration is in charge. But in fact, if the governor of New Jersey sues, then in the end, the judge who decides that lawsuit about equitable transportation funding and the environmental implications and whatnot, the person ultimately in charge of that project is the judge. That's a very different reality. That's a very different political architecture. That is a very different way to decide how the family is going to, where the family is going to eat on any given Friday night. I don't think, and I'll sort of leave it here and then open it to discussion. I don't think that we want to go back to an age where Robert Moses is able to make these choices, or the villain in Chinatown, which came out right around the moment of the power broker coming out. People remember it was the guy who was building infrastructure to bring water from the valley into LA. There was a reason that there was in the culture in the early 70s was sort of this notion that the establishment was bad. It had proven itself wrong on lots and lots of issues. But we've overcorrected for that impulse. The impulse to say we need to diffuse authority, we need to give everyone more voice in the process so that they are not trampled or bulldozed by the establishment. We need to have some sort of mechanism if we're going to have high-speed rail, if we're going to have better infrastructure, if we're going to have clean energy transmission lines, if we're going to have more housing. We need to empower someone in the end to make a decision that will benefit some and disadvantage others, and that we can accept those trade-offs. We need someone to be able to ratify the trade-offs that are inherent in big projects. I haven't yet found an entirely satisfactory mechanism or way of balancing the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian instincts. How you empower someone to make a decision without entirely foregoing any public objection. How you balance these things, and you know, the end result is not that you will have perfect projects that don't inconvenience anyone. The question is, how do you, in projects where there are trade-offs, how do you find some equitable way to move to a final decision more expeditiously? I think that would bring down the cost of high-speed rail dramatically. Just having a process for doing that, and that's the sort of reform movement that I think that we need now, is to find that balance. So I think that's roughly, Rick, how long you wanted me to speak. And now I'd love to open it up to you and to anyone else and have a broader discussion.
Rick, you're on mute.
There's a number of disconnected thoughts that are coming to my head you know, I made it through the power broker, where at the beginning, boy, I could feel his pain as he's standing. I think he was on a bridge and he was looking, there should be a park here. And he was frustrated that he couldn't get a park, and he decided to work for the bureaucracy, and he couldn't get anything to move. So he figured out how to get the power to make stuff happen.
Yeah.
And then I got to the point where I kind of saw him as Anakin Skywalker, where there's a point in the movie where Anakin has switched to the dark side and nobody knows yet.
Yeah.
And that's the point that I got to in the book. So that does become a big conundrum of how do you make this balance actually work? And then I want to emphasize, I've been saying for a long time, this idea, there's just nobody in charge, right? And so that is the biggest problem with California high-speed rail. Nobody was committed enough to it at the beginning to be in charge of it and say, this is how we're going to do it. So they weren't ready when they got money. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion about whether it should have gone through the cities in the Central Valley, which it's doing, or along I-5. I think that misses the point of, it should have gone through the cities, but it shouldn't have said, well, we're going to go around Madera because Madera complained more than the others. And we're going to cut through this orchard because this rancher over here has the ear of the governor and this one doesn't. So we're going to go out of the way and all of that. And it keeps coming back to nobody's in charge. And so I guess you kind of said you're not sure how we get to somebody in charge. And I'm not sure where to take it from there. I have those immediate reactions that I think are important here. But I do want to lead into a specific question, which is, clearly a lot of people were frustrated with the current state of affairs on the first week of November. Yeah. And they voted for change. Let's make that proposition that there were a lot of people who said, I don't like this system. And I was very frustrated that the feds were moving so slowly on the rail money. But we've led into a period of very rapid change that we don't know where it's going. So do you have thoughts on what we asked for or how we influence that, so we can view this not as entirely as a crisis, but more as an opportunity to get a new system out of this?
So, I mean, to my mind, you know, there's lots of articles and lots of explanations for why Trump was so successful in November. At root, my analysis is that there is a zeitgeist in the country that feels as though government doesn't work in all sorts of facets, and that they want to shake things up. You know, Trump's political teeth were cut. I mean, it's funny how much of this conversation has been about New York, and I'm sort of only perusing. I see there's 99 comments in the chat. It seems like a lot of them are about California, and I'm just keep on talking about New York. Or in Texas. But you know, Trump's rise into the political sphere happened because Ed Koch's Parks Department in New York City wasn't able to redo Woolman Rink, this ice skating rink in Central Park. And you know, they were over budget, and the Parks Department just sort of fell down on the job, and they spent several $1 million on a project, and flipped the switch, and it didn't keep the ice cold. And so Koch was humiliated. And the reason that the project hadn't worked was that there had been a law passed decades earlier, an anti-graft law called Wick's Law, which made it required that when it was a municipal project, that the electricity, the paving, the plumbing, that they all be bid out separately. And the reason for this was that there was a fear at the time that the mayor of Schenectady was going to create, BS public works projects and then give the contracts to his brother-in-law, right? That was the notion was that if you split up the contracts, you couldn't do shenanigans like that. And so for that reason, New York was basically the city of New York's Parks Department was rendered incompetent when just trying to rebuild an ice rink. And in that case, what Koch did was he handed the whole thing over to Trump, and Trump did it under budget, like that, with a general contractor, and it was done. And I think that there is some notion in this moment where Trump is trying to do the same basic thing. He's, the Doge stuff is designed to simplify, he claims, to simplify the way that the government works, to root out superfluous regulation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know whether he'll be successful. I don't know what will be effective. I don't like. There are lots of things we don't know. I can't tell what Doge is from moment to moment. But that being said, my hope is that people see this moment as a reason to say, let's start thinking more holistically about how we can create systems in public authority that work in all sorts of realms. How do we make it so that the permitting system for new housing is more expeditious? How do we make it so that our ability to build transmission lines across forests so that we can get clean energy to the places where loaded is required, that's more expeditious? In this realm of high-speed rail, I think we should be, Rick, to your point, the sort of notion that no one's in charge, like, it seems to me that we should be, that those of us who are interested in improving the nation's infrastructure should be saying, we need a system where someone is in charge. That's at the end of the day, someone who needs to be accountable and be held accountable. And we need to be arguing not just for more plans or more money or whatnot. We need to be sort of arguing from a procedural perspective. This is the reason that things aren't working. This is the reason that rail here is so much more expensive than it is there. This is the reason that we're strangely connecting, I think, and I'll have to be corrected, Modesto and Bakersfield by high speed, in a way that like there is demand. I live in Providence, and some on this call will be aware that we just opened South Coast Rail here in Massachusetts, which connects New Bedford and Fall River to Boston. The drive is 55 minutes without traffic. The train line is an hour and a half one way. I don't know who's going to take this line, but we spent well more than $1 billion on it. Is that a smart public investment? And like, if that's where we got, who was in charge of that process? I think we need sort of more explanation. And I'm just, the core of it is like, there was an article, I think in the New York Times, a couple of years ago, about how people are still making sure that the power broker is displayed behind them when they are interviewed on MSNBC. People like this, to this day, the notion is that the problem in infrastructure is that power has not been diffused enough to communities so that these sort of imperious figures like Robert Moses are going to do damage to underprivileged communities or minority communities or whatever. That's a real concern in some cases, but like a system where no one is in charge is a system where everyone suffers. And we need to at least be thinking about that as we make efforts towards reform.
And you pointed out housing, which to some degree, the efforts of like Strong Towns and others is on housing to push it down.
Yep.
So that more individuals can make different decisions about the land that they own. But with high-speed rail, it's crossing state lines. So that means it's got to be federal. And so it's part of the challenge here is it's different based on what the issue is.
I mean, there is this, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson just came out with this book, Abundance. Yoni Applebaum came out with a book called Stuck about housing. There is sort of an emerging literature about how the lessons of the 50s and 60s have been overlearned, and that we need to increase supplies of rail, of transmission, of housing, of all sorts of things. In my view, housing has raced ahead of high-speed rail, of clean energy transmission in sort of the, certainly on the left, because the solution on the housing front is, to your very point, to push power down. The YIMBYs are saying there's too much power in the neighborhood influencing what the person who owns the lot can do. And it's very comfortable to say, don't prevent someone from doing what they want on their own piece of land. Like, that makes intuitive sense. It appeals across the political spectrum. There's a libertarian and a communitarian aspect to YIMBYism, because it pushes power down. To your point exactly, there's no way to do a clean power transmission line or a high-speed rail line, or even like I mean, well, I'm not going to go into it, but even on low-speed rail, we're not making these decisions in the right way. We're not putting anyone in charge who can sort of say, where is there a market for high-speed rail where we can actually build it in an effective way, make these trade-offs. We're going to do this thing, this hard thing. We're just like there are so many voices in the room, so many people at the table, that you end up with a mishmash of stuff, and then the implication is that you get a project that, I mean, I don't know whether the California high-speed rail project is that going to be a feather in your cap, or if it goes, is it going to be a barrier to future projects? And that's the travesty of it.
Well, fortunately, so just to be clear, in my view, the Central Valley was the right place to start, and you have to understand where the mountains are. And if you're looking at a flat map, you're like, why would you start there? Well, if you're looking at a topographical map, oh, I get it. Fortunately, there's a much easier project to get built, which is Rancho Cucamonga to Las Vegas. It's easier because it's in a highway right of way. So physically it's easier to do. But also in that case, there was one guy in charge, and now is a different, but it's one guy. And at the beginning, his name was Anthony Marnell. And he's like, I want high-speed rail to my casino, and I'm going to figure out how to make it happen. And then he sold the project to Wes Eaton, and Wes Eaton's in charge now, right? So I think Brightline changes the discussion about high-speed rail, but it doesn't answer the question about governance, because you're not going to have on most projects an entrepreneur who thinks it's a good idea. But there's a question here from the audience. There's a high level of frustration that California high-speed rail is like the project that, whichever side you're on, if your government, it needs to work, but it's not working, you bring up high-speed rail. And if you say government, it's not working, so we should shut down government, it's California high-speed rail. Why do you think that's the issue that gains so much attention?
Among all of I'm not sure I understand the question. Why?
So you mentioned it in your book just very shortly. Ezra has used it as an example where he's saying, I want high-speed rail and government's not delivering it to me. And then you kind of have to get through that to get to the, we need to fix it. And then, there are other folks on the other side who are like, this proves that high-speed rail never worked because government can't deliver it. We should just kill it now. Why is that such a, a lightning rod issue?
Well, I just think it makes so much intuitive sense that you would connect LA and San Francisco by high-speed rail. I mean, in the same way that it makes sense that you would connect Washington and New York, right? These are projects that intuitively, like, why are people flying? Why are people driving? These are places that could be connected by rail. We know that places like this would be connected by high speeds in Europe. They would be in various parts of Asia, but we can't get it done here. So I think that the reason that it comes up is because people have traveled overseas and come back, and it seems like such an obvious project, and it's the one that isn't getting done. There are all sorts of great project ideas out there, all sorts of realms: housing, infrastructure, rail. I think the reason that someone like Ezra and Derek would focus on California high-speed rail is that it to a broader audience that is as not engaged with this debate at all, it's not following what's happening in this industry or in any given industry. It is indicative of a much larger phenomenon, much larger concern that government doesn't work. I was talking to Ezra at one point, and we were talking about progressivism generally, and I said, there's this remarkable moment among progressives who are very frustrated when government doesn't work, and then say, but I want government to play a larger role in all these other realms of life. So, like, and I'm sure that there's a variety of views on this call, if you believe in single payer healthcare means that basically the people who are running the Federal Railroad Administration, right? The government bureaucrats are going to have a larger role to play in your healthcare. If we're not able to get high-speed rail, why would you empower that institution to do more things in your life? So I think that people are choosing high-speed rail because it seems like an obvious thing that the world of public authority should be able to deliver in an expeditious way, and is not. And so from there, you can either make the argument, therefore, government is, as a concept, a broken institution and things should be done in the private sector entirely, which is what one half of the country thinks. Or you can say we ought to fix it so that government does work. But but everyone can agree that it's a travesty. And then that's sort of a springboard for arguments on both sides.
That's very helpful. Chris, we've got a few minutes. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have lots of questions, and unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all. Theo, who gets credit for the idea to host this talk today, had a couple of them. Here's one. He says, dysfunctional blue state governance is often cited as one reason for Democrats' recent political struggles. Gavin Newsom has been talking about this challenge quite a bit lately, but can you point to other politicians at either the state or federal level who are, engaging with this dilemma and offering ideas to address it?
I mean, there's a whole host of them. I mean, I hesitate on a call like this to, off the top of my head. I mean, you're seeing, at some point, if Josh Shapiro runs for president, we're going to be talking about the fact that he had I-95 rebuilt expeditiously when it collapsed outside of Philadelphia. Like, that will be the big feather in his cap, I think, probably. You've got Rahm Emanuel talking about it. You've got Richie Torres in New York talking about it. You've got the governor of Kentucky, Bashir, talking about like, this is emerging increasingly as a defining issue for a certain breed of progressives who are seeing this distinction. You know, there was this shift after the Power Broker comes out. Gary Hart runs for Senate in Colorado, and the sort of the core message of his campaign is that we need to tear down the establishment, which was just entirely at odds with what previous progressives had argued. They want to build up organizations like the Tennessee Valley Authority. I think that we're at a similar inflection point where we're going to go back to new ideas about what to do with public power, who should wield it, and I think that'll be a really interesting part of the coming campaigns.
Thank you. Michael says other countries have built rail and transit lines more cheaply. Do they not? And then he asks, do they not care about the same things that we care about in the U.S., or do they just handle those concerns differently?
I mean, they handle things differently. I'm sure there are value differences, but you know, in Spain, if you want to build a transit project in a city, the federal government comes in and builds it and then hands it off to the local agency. In New York, it's the MTA actually doing the project. There are broad implications of that distinction, right? If you're the federal government if you're the national government of Spain, you aren't so worried about pissing off the union base, right? If you're the MTA, those are your constituents. And so the process of making these decisions really varies from place to place. You know, one extreme is China, where like, you know, local control completely doesn't exist, right? Entire neighborhoods are bulldozed almost without any mind to the people that are living there and might object. We're sort of at the other end of that spectrum, and we probably like it that way. But there are some, you know, there's some room in the middle where I think that nobody wants to have the high-speed rail line driven through their home, and at the same time, you can't have it so that everyone who objects wins the argument. And so we have to figure out some sort of mechanism to be able to metabolize the public interest broadly and individual interests that object.
Thanks. Let's try and get to maybe two more. Johan asks about the effects of lobbying, such as by the fossil fuel industry. Has this played a role in the difficulty of getting things done in terms of transportation besides building highways? Is this something that you discuss in your book?
I'm sure that it does on the margins. This is not a big focus of my book, and really, you know, the sort of notion of sort of special interests playing a role. Everyone's got special interests. There are always special interests. The question is, how do you metabolize, again, sort of the broad public interest with those who object? And some systems do it better than others. Ours doesn't do it well at this particular time.
Okay. Do you have time for one more?
One more.
Okay. Theo asks, do you believe Elon Musk's recent program of destruction, he calls it, will contribute to a renewed or reaffirmed skepticism towards concentrated power, and by doing this undermine the rebalancing toward the Hamiltonian impulse that you called for?
I don't know what the implications of Doge are. I do think that rather than being reflexively critical of everything he and Trump do, that everyone, both Republicans and Democrats who have concerns about it, should be thinking, where is this impulse coming from? You know, like, it was sort of remarkable to me when Elon sent out an email asking public employees what they had accomplished in the previous week. Like, maybe we don't like him, someone who doesn't have line authority, going past secretaries of various departments asking this question, but it's a reasonable question to ask. In the private sector, people are asked, what did you accomplish in the previous week, all the time? And my hope is that rather than simply say, this is terrible, that reform itself, that we want to protect the status quo, that everyone recognizes that the status quo hasn't worked, and we begin thinking and having arguments about what should replace it. because we do need some sort of system that will get us to more expeditious.
Okay. Well, thank you. For anyone interested in buying a copy of the book, I put the link in the chat. And thank you, Mark, and thank you all for being here. Rick, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate your time today. I found your book to be incredibly valuable. I'm looking forward to us making progress over the next few years. And thank you very much for coming. And to everybody on board, thank you for listening. And please remember the Become a Member button up on the upper right-hand part of the screen. So thank you, and hopefully we will talk again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.